All right, take it away, Jessica.
Awesome. I'm all ready. I have my lucky stick that my 5-year-old made for me. So nothing can go wrong, other than the fact that I have no voice, because I lovingly wasted it on my statistics course this morning. So you're welcome, many of whom are here. I'm thrilled to share my research with you today. I've been working on this for so long, and I'm so excited, and a special thank you to my committee here at CGU and Dr. Edmondson. I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. So much of my work is based on work you've done, and I'm just really honored that you were willing to join us. So thank you so much. So my dissertation is entitled Under Threat, and it's an empirical test of the social identity theory of psychological safety, which you will be hearing a little bit more about. So quick orientation to where we're going today. I'm going to start with a bit of background, and then I'll teach you a little bit about the social identity theory of psychological safety that I developed. And then I'll overview the 2 studies that I conducted as part of my dissertation, and finally close with some thoughts on theoretical implications of my findings, practical implications, and then where I'm excited to take this research moving forward. So I want to start though with a picture of my hometown. And many of you will recognize this as the mural commemorating the death of George Floyd, who was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department in 2020. And although there have been many individuals and groups that have been working towards racial equity for long before George Floyd's murder, George Floyd's death triggered sort of a series or a tidal wave of racial justice and racial unrest in this country. And organizations followed suit, and they poured time and money and effort into creating what they're calling, inclusive workplaces, or workplaces where individuals perceive that belonging and authenticity is valued. And we know that from a resource perspective and a time perspective, organizations really began to make diversity, equity, and inclusion work a priority beginning in 2020. These stats you see in front of you here are from 2021, but simultaneously, they haven't moved the needle on equity in organizations in a measurable way. And so scholars have called for more research understanding what's the disconnect between what we aspire to and where we are, right? And what are the psychological mechanisms that underpin discrimination, that underpin inclusion, and that underpin or explain the failure of so many DE&I efforts. And in my research a couple of years ago, I started to look at psychological safety, originally developed by Dr. Edmondson, who we have here today, which I define in my current studies as the belief that a team or an organization is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And my thinking about psychological safety as a vehicle for promoting inclusion is actually something that organizations have started to do. So if we look at organizations and popular literature, we start to see them talking about psychological safety as a really important precursor to inclusion, and even expanding the construct to mean or represent the ability or feeling of being able to show up as oneself to work. But as often the case in scholarship, we lag behind a little bit of popular press, right? And if you look at the majority of the research on psychological safety, with the exception of a couple key studies by Singh, and then much more recent work in the last couple of years since George Floyd, right? The literature on psychological safety is relatively what I call identity agnostic, right? So it essentially acts as if the antecedents, the outcomes, the moderators of psychological safety operate similarly, regardless of one's social identity. And so if we really want to think about psychological safety as a vehicle for inclusion, we needed to re-examine it or reevaluate it through the lens of one's social identity. And so in response to that need, I developed what I call the social identity theory of psychological safety. And this is essentially a re-examination of how psychological safety unfolds and its outcomes, but through the lens of social identity. So social identity, many of you will be familiar with it, right? It's the portion of our self-concept that we derive from membership in a social group, right? And amongst many other tenets of social identity theory, but at its core, that's what it represents. And so this theory sort of re-examined psychological safety and its processes through that lens. This is not what I'm going to share in detail with you today. This is currently under review at AMR, Academy of Management. But the subordinate goal of my dissertation was to test a significant portion of this theory, which you see in front of you. So to begin, in thinking about integrating psychological safety and inclusion, I hypothesized that there would be a positive and reciprocal relationship between the two. So if we think about the authenticity dimension of inclusion, right? We can extend that to authenticity in voicing our opinions, our reactions, our thoughts, right? Thereby rendering us more psychologically safe. And then vice versa, right? When we take those interpersonal risks and we're welcomed without judgment, that ultimately drives us to feel like we belong and that our authenticity is valued. Now, the question is, what does the social identity aspect of that look like? And so to do that, I borrowed largely from Purdy Vaughns, who writes about social identity and social identity threat. And the process of my theory is this idea that cues in an individual's environment activate one sense of either identity safety or identity devaluation. And that identity devaluation materializes in social identity threat, which is real or perceived, right? Threat to an individual's self-concept based on membership in a particular social group. And then that social identity threat has a negative impact on both psychological safety and ultimately inclusion. And thinking about the relationship between social identity threat and psych safety, so why does social identity threat actually make us less likely to take those interpersonal risks? We can think about a series of sort of intra-individual, so within individual cognitive reactions that happen when somebody experiences threat. So borrowing from sort of classic theories of stress, right, Lazarus and Folkman's stress model, the initial appraisal of stress happens when you experience that social identity threat. And that triggers a secondary appraisal in which we try to respond to that threat, right, with coping mechanisms or actions that are going to protect us from additional sources of threat. So in the instance of social identity threat, the most common intracognitive reaction is a hyper focus on self-monitoring or self-regulation. So we can think about the idea that like you essentially become really performance oriented, right? And when we're performance oriented, we avoid interpersonal risk at all costs in an effort to protect ourselves from additional threat, right? So when we experience social identity threat, we therefore feel less psychologically safe to take risks because it poses an opening for additional instances of social identity threat. So there are lots of identity contingent cues in the literature, and I chose to look at 3 in particular at cross-level analyses. So one at the organizational level, one at the team level, and one at the interpersonal level. And starting with the organizational level, I looked at hierarchical structures, or the degree to which your organization is formally organized as a hierarchy. Now, the majority of organizations in the United States are organized formally as hierarchies, but we also know from Hobbes' work that informal hierarchies still emerge, even in organizations that we consider flat, right, through processes of social categorization or prototypicality. And so there's some element of hierarchy that usually exists in all organizations. But to understand the relationship between hierarchical structures and social identity threat, we have to consider the broader context in which organizations are situated. So if we look at social dominance theory, we understand that society as a whole, so bigger than organizations, is organized into itself a hierarchy that's based on social identity, right? And it affords more power, more privilege, more status to individuals who hold dominant identities. So in the case of my particular research, which focuses on race, right? Social dominance theory says we afford more power and privilege to white individuals than we do to individuals of color. So when organizations replicate those hierarchies that exist societally, right, it further entrenches the power and privilege that gets awarded to dominant individuals. And sort of secondarily, we know that when dominant individuals are in power in organizations, they have control in shaping the structures that uphold those organizations. So if we look at really common organizational features like feedback or performance management, right, there's sort of a plethora of research that shows that the way those functions can themselves be discriminatory, right? So we see that hierarchical structures then might trigger this sense of identity devaluation that manifests as in social identity. The second antecedent that I looked at was at the work group level, and I looked at work group cultures of conformity. And this is based on, I'm going to get nerdy because I love her work, Hewlin. So in 2003, Hewlin came up with this idea of facades of conformity. And she conceptualized facades of conformity as an individual's suppression of their own personal values in exchange for kind of falsely pretending to embrace organizational ones, right? So in an effort to feel like we belong to something, we'll conform to either the behaviors or the values of other people, even when they run counter to our own, right? But that conformity signals identity devaluation because we're unable to stay true to our own internal values and behaviors, right? And we see social identity threat manifest. What I did was think about organizations where there are entire cultures, right? Where those assimilationist behaviors aren't just rewarded, but are actually expected, right? So I was interested in taking her idea and thinking about, could we use that at a work group culture level to describe a team or a group? And then finally, I looked at microaggressions, which are sort of everyday encounters that directly invalidate someone's social identity. And specifically, I looked at racial microaggressions. This whole study is in the context of race rather than other possible social identities. And this one, there's the link between microaggressions and social identity threat is very obvious, right? Microaggressions is a direct devaluation of one's identity, which then manifests affectively and cognitively as social identity threat. But the reason that I opted to include it is because there isn't research linking that and psychological safety, right? So the other two are a bit more seemingly innocuous and I think more interesting for that reason. But microaggressions and psychological safety have yet to be linked empirically. And so I wanted to establish that. So then kind of holistically, I also hypothesized that then social identity threat, for those of you who are familiar with from a statistical perspective, that would explain the relationships between these three environmental cues and psychological safety. So mediating, right, these relationships. So then this begs the question as an organizational psychologist who's interested in fixing things, right? Well, what do we do to interrupt this process? And here in my theory, I hypothesized two different types of moderators, right? Two different types of disruptors. The first is what I called safety activating. So these are moderators that can actually interrupt the impact of environmental cues and preserve people's feelings of social identity safety, right? And so in this case, I looked at the role of representation of leaders of color. So this was operationalized as the percentage of leaders at a mid-level that people perceived identified as managers of color, and also the percentage of BIPOC leaders at an executive level. And I modeled those as a latent factor, which I'll talk about in a little bit. There's already a lot of research that shows the direct relationship between representation and social identity threat. So we know that, for example, when Black participants take an exam in a room with other Black participants, they do better, right, than when they take a test in a room with more white participants. And that same trend holds for gender as well. So when women take an exam in a room with more women, right, they do better from a performance perspective than when they're with a mixed group. But I was more interested in the way that this might actually disrupt the relationship between hierarchy and social identity threat. So if you think about hierarchy as sort of replicating and magnifying the social identity-based hierarchies that exist societally, well, when we put leaders of color in those positions, we're directly contradicting or shifting the power balance away from the dominant group. And so I sort of hypothesized that this would actually weaken, right, or attenuate the relationship between hierarchical structures and social identity threat. And then the second class of moderators are what we call threat buffering. So these come into play once someone actually has experienced social identity threat. So it doesn't prevent social identity threat from arising, but it preserves your psychological safety and inclusion once threat has happened. So here I look at inclusive leadership, and there's a lot of literature linking inclusive leadership directly to psychological safety. So Carmelli's work on the role, Harrock's work on the role of inclusive leadership in promoting psychological safety. But again, here I was looking at how inclusive leadership might sort of signal an identity valuation in contradiction to the social identity threat devaluation that happens. And in addition to sort of the direct, I value you, right, that we also know that inclusive leaders model, right? So thinking about social modeling, gotta throw a Bandura reference in there for you, right? What? I passed. Maybe he doesn't know that Becky's an avid fan of Bandura. So, right, that inclusive leaders also model what behaviors are appropriate and rewarded. So in addition to their sort of direct influence, they're also signaling to the rest of their team that inclusive behaviors on the part of team members are expected and rewarded as well. So as I said, superordinate goal, test this piece of this theory that I came up with, right? And different parts, primarily starting with this core idea that social identity threat represents a direct damage to psychological safety. So enter study one. Very simple hypothesis, right? Social identity threat will lead to decreases in psychological safety over time. This study was done with 386 participants collected via Prolific. And as you'll see in the race breakdown, this is true across all of my studies. All of my studies were deliberately set up to be about half white participants and half participants who identified as somebody of color. In this study one, I used Edmondson's original psychological safety scale. It was adapted slightly because I collected this over time. So it asked people to respond to her items in the past week. And then I also used an adapted version of social identity threat by Bellamy. So I conducted a pilot study previous to both of my primary studies, where I took out from the social identity threat scale the behavioral based items. So social identity threat is conceptualized as affective and cognitive, but if you look at the scale, there's actually a perception of mistreatment subdimension, and those items really closely resemble microaggressions. And so to avoid issues of multicollinearity, I took those out, re-specified the model, confirmed its structure using a confirmatory factor analysis, right, with robust maximum likelihood, and also established its convergent and divergent validity, not a full validation, but a pretty substantial pilot validation. And alphas across all 4 time points were really strong. All right, so how does model one work? This is the sort of pièce de résistance of this, if I can get this right. So first of all, psychological safety and social identity threat were measured each week, right, over the course of 4 weeks. And ultimately, in order to establish the relationship between social identity threat and psychological safety, the key is being able to explain or identify or specify all of the possible sources of psychological safety in a given week. So the first thing that we do is these squares or rectangles represent someone's score on their psychological safety measure in that week. But we know that people's scores on a measure are influenced by a lot of different things, right? Some are stable, some are not. And so the first thing we do in this type of model is we model all of those as a latent factor, right? So the score is one byproduct of that, but it's that circle that represents someone's psychological safety in a given week. And to understand the rest of the model, I want us to just focus in on psychological safety at week 3. So we're thinking about, how do I predict someone's psychological safety in week 3? And remember that the relationship of interest here is, how does social identity threat impact someone's psychological safety? So how does my social identity threat that I experienced last week, right, impact my psychological safety this week? In order to infer that as causal, which we usually cannot in correlational design, we have to be able to eliminate all of the other possible causes or influences of psychological safety in week 3. So the first thing that we specify is a relationship between my psych safety last week and my psych safety this week. So this is technically, it's called an autoregressive path, but you can think about it like a carry spillover effect, right? However I felt last week's gonna have some impact on this week. We also specify or model what we call shocks. And these are things that might happen that week in an organization that are gonna impact both my psychological safety and my social identity threat. So maybe you just finished an all hands meeting where the CEO announced layoffs, right? And that's gonna have a shock-based effect on that week's social identity threat and psych safety, but not last week's, so we have to account for it. And then finally, sort of the big piece of this, and what's often not able to be modeled in correlational designs, is the fact that we're all different, right? And some of that difference is stable, so maybe I just have a baseline psychological safety that's higher than yours, and some of it is more state-like, right? I woke up in a really great mood, and so I'm feeling more psychologically safe today. We model all of that remaining variance in what we call a random intercept. So it soaks up all of the remaining variance in our observational and our observed variable, psychological safety at week 3. And that allows us to infer that cross-lag path from social identity to psychological safety as causal, right? So the full model looks like this. I didn't start there on purpose, okay? And as you can see, model fit here is pretty high, all of our thresholds meet accepted limits. And when we dig into the results a little bit, remember that our hypothesis was that higher instances of social identity threat would lead to lower instances of psychological safety. And in fact, we find a significant negative cross-line path between the two. So hypothesis one is fully supported. Interestingly, although not hypothesized, we also find a significant negative relationship between psychological safety and social identity threat. So that means your experience of psychological safety this week actually leads to, right, causes lower feelings of social identity threat in the following week, which I think proves sort of foreshadowing in a good way of the role of psychological safety on inclusion, right? That psychological safety can actually have a protective element in addition to the other way around. Now, the question, if we're thinking about this from a social identity perspective, is do these things operate similarly based on participant race? So exploratorily, I broke up these cross-line models based on race. And what we find, interestingly, is both relationships go away when we only look at white participants. And both relationships strengthen, right, when we look at participants of color. And in fact, those relationships for participants of color are so strong that when you combine the full sample together, the paths are both significant, right? But white participants have no relationship in either direction. All right, so moving on to study two. So study two tested the more full piece of the theory, right? And again, I used a combination here. I started with a convenient sample, and as I'll explain in my limitations, had to sort of fill the rest of my data collection with prolific. Much larger sample, again, racially diverse. From a measures perspective, I used Jansen's inclusion scale, right? Edmondson's psychological safety scale, again, though not modified to past tense. The social identity threat measure that I used in study one. Hierarchical structures. And then work group cultures of conformity. I mentioned that my conceptualization at the work group level was based on Hewlin's facades of conformity scale. So I also piloted that adaptation. And I piloted both the elevation to the group level and the culture variable, but also added some additional items to enhance content validity, right? There are some items at the group level that could kind of capture things that might not be present at the individual level. Again, use confirmatory factor analysis with very strong model fit, right? And establish its convergent and divergent validity. Microaggressions, classic Torres-Harding scale. BIPOC representation, I modeled as a 2-item latent factor. So percentage of managers of color at the mid-level and percentage of executives of color, right, at the C-suite or VP level, and then regress those onto, represented by a latent factor of representation. And then inclusive leadership, which is a commonly used but new scale by Al Alwi. So study two procedures was a survey design, right, to enhance sort of best practices. All of my blocks of questions were randomized, all my items were randomized, and then I inserted pretty substantial distractor tasks in between my outcomes, my moderators, and my predictors. And then I also tested for any significant issues of common method bias, right? And we know Harmon's single factor test suggests that your single item percentage be below 50%. So this indicates essentially no significant issues of common method bias that might skew our result or our interpretation. And then I did offer an optional raffle entry, which proved very problematic, and I'll talk about that at the end. Okay, so here's my study two model, right? And I put the model coefficients on here for you, but what I really want you to pay attention to is the model fit, which is horrible, right? So this model doesn't work. And so I went looking to figure out why, right? Which is what we do when models don't work. And what you find is if you look at the regression path between microaggressions and social identity threat, it's really high for a path model, 0.68. And so I dug in a little bit to, okay, what's the relationship between social identity threat and microaggressions? And I looked at the tolerance, right, which tells us sort of our degree of multicollinearity between the two. My stat students are nodding, right? And it's really high, right? And in addition, the correlation between the two on their own is 0.8, right? So they're sharing a ton of variance. And if we think theoretically that makes sense. Remember, I started at the beginning that I took out some of those behavioral based items. I didn't take them all out, right? And so essentially what we're finding is that this idea of social identity threat is actually explaining both the variance in the original social identity threat items and the variance in these microaggression items. So I re-specified this model with social identity threat as a latent factor encompassed with both of those two scales together. So here's what my re-specified model looks like. Model fit, as you can see, is much better, right? Nearly everything is within range. And we also see everything is significant, right? With the exception of microaggressions, which we couldn't test. So returning back to my original hypotheses, all of my main effects, right, fully supported, with the exception of microaggressions, because we didn't test it in the re-specified model. All of the indirect effects, both the primary indirect effects, so social identity as an explanation between antecedents and psychological safety, but also a serial indirect effect. So all the way to inclusion, right? Both significant, obviously didn't test microaggressions in this model. And then both moderating effects. So both representation and leadership and inclusive leadership attenuated or weakened the negative impact, right, of their respective predictor on the outcome of interest. And what would I be without a moderation graph, right? So here's our moderation graph for representation and leadership. And what's most interesting is if you look at high representation, so that tiny dotted line, you can see that it's not, the simple slope is not significantly different from zero. So in instances of high representation, there's effectively eliminates a relationship between hierarchical structures and social identity threat. Now in inclusive leadership, we don't see that same eliminating effect. All three simple slopes are significant, but we do see that in instances of high inclusive leadership, right, the relationship between social identity threat and psychological safety is diminished. All right, so of course, exploratorily, I was interested in whether these differ based on race. So I fit a series of 2 additional models, little stats lesson here, right? I fit one model where I forced the path coefficients to be the same across the 2 racial groups. And then I fit an unconstrained model where I allowed those paths and intercepts to vary, right, based on group. And then you compare those models to figure out, do you in fact have differences between racial groups in your relationships of interest? And if we look at our model fit, they're actually fairly similar, more similar than I anticipated, but there's still a significant difference between the two, with the unconstrained model, meaning racial differences, fitting the data better than a constrained model. So let's look at the path coefficients for those 2 groups. So starting with white participants, right? What's super interesting about this is, although the 2 indirect effects for hierarchy are not significant, all of the path coefficients are still significant with the exception, right, of BIPOC representation of leadership. So essentially what this means is for white participants, cultures of conformity and hierarchical structures are still triggering racial social identity threat, and that is still impacting their psychological safety and inclusion. Not what I expected, but really interesting. And so we can look at the literature on dominant social identity threat to give us some insight into why this might happen. So dominant social identity threat focuses on racial identity threat experienced by members of the dominant racial group. And it's come up recently a lot because as organizations shift to focusing on DE&I, that focus almost gets ingrained from a normative perspective at the organizational level. So all of a sudden, this conformity is actually about conforming to inclusive behaviors, right? And those at the top of the hierarchy are often the ones championing those inclusive behaviors. So that can trigger one of 2 types of white or dominant social identity threat. The first being prototypicality, or the fear of sort of losing one's state of privilege. This is often a subconscious form of social identity threat, or group image threat, right? Which is often a type of threat that's experienced by people who kind of espouse egalitarian values, right? It matters to them to be inclusive. And so they're worried in instances of inclusion efforts or DE&I efforts that they'll be perceived as discriminatory, right? And so that then leads them to be anxious about their own racial identity in those circumstances. So here's that re-specified model for participants of color. And most interestingly, as expected, all of the indirect effects between our environmental cues and both psychological safety and inclusion are significant through social identity threat. The one interesting and surprising finding here is that inclusive leadership doesn't moderate, right? And I think that, you know what, in retrospect, this makes sense to me. If you have social identity threat that's coming as a function of all of these organizational features, having one great inclusive leader isn't necessarily enough to preserve your psychological safety from the impact of that threat, right? So one inclusive leader is important, but it's not enough in this circumstance. So then I decided to do one more because Jess likes to play with models, as we know, right? And so in this last exploratory model, I moved inclusive leadership to moderate the relationship between cultures of conformity and social identity threat, right? Again, model fit here is really strong. And if we look at the relationship for white participants, neither moderates, right? And there's no longer a relationship between social identity threat and psychological safety. So we still see that impact of cultures of conformity and hierarchical structures, but it's a relatively short-lived experience, right? So I might experience social identity threat on the basis of my white identity, but it isn't strong enough to then translate to me feeling psychologically unsafe in my organization. However, for participants of color, that is not the case, right? So for participants of color, we still see a significant impact of social identity threat on both psychological safety and inclusion. And all four of our indirect effects, both our just sort of simple indirect effect and our serial indirect effects, are still significant. What's interesting here is that BIPOC representation and leadership is no longer a significant moderator. And there are sort of two ways of explaining this. One is statistical, one is theoretical. So from a statistical perspective, when we introduce inclusive leadership into this model as a moderator before identity threat, it's such a strong moderator that we've soaked up or explained most of the variance we can in social identity threat. What does that mean, like pragmatically or theoretically? It means that ultimately inclusive leadership is a stronger interrupter, right, than BIPOC representation. It doesn't mean that BIPOC representation doesn't have an impact. It means that inclusive leadership is having such a strong impact that whether or not you have BIPOC representation at that point doesn't matter as much for social identity threat. And here is the exploratory model. This is the only moderation that was significant. So this sort of mirrors what we saw in the other one, that inclusive leadership helps weaken the relationship between cultures of conformity and social identity threat. So to close, I want to discuss some theoretical and practical implications. So first of all, this is the first time that we've re-examined psychological safety really through the lens of social identity, right? So understanding how social identity plays a role in the enactment or the hindrance of psychological safety and by extension inclusion. In Edmondson and Lay's recent review, they talked a lot about the need for cross-level examination of how psychological safety unfolds. So although I didn't explicitly test interactions amongst my antecedents, I purposely wanted to set up antecedents at cross-level, different levels of analysis and organization to show how psychological safety unfolds, right, through not just individual, but also interpersonal, group, and organizational level factors. I think the biggest one is this study, the series of studies, establishes race as a boundary condition, right? We've very clearly shown that psychological safety does not operate in the same way based on one's racial social identity, right? And that needs to be considered when thinking about both the antecedents and the outcomes of the construct. And then finally, I think this has implications for psychological safety measurement, right? So the original psychological safety scale was meant to be measured at the teen level, but past research has shown, Simpson, for example, shows you have about 67% of the variance is different between people, even within the same group, right? And so I think the fact that psychological safety unfolds really differently has implications for measuring psychological safety as an individual perception. And if you're going to elevate it to a group perception, then at the very least, I think calls for researchers to use really stringent measures of group aggregation. So things like, within group agreement, RWG, or interclass correlation measures, right, ICCs. And also I think there's some cool literature on LMX differentiation, which actually measures the degree of disagreement in a group. And I'd like to see that sort of moved into the psych safety space. How much disagreement is there on this team about perceived levels of psychological safety? From a practical standpoint, right, clearly establishes psychological safety as an important antecedent to inclusion, right? And says to organizations, hey, measure it, prioritize it, use it as a proximal indicator of inclusion, right? But bring it into your conversations and your efforts around DE&I. Two, I think looking at the role of hierarchy and cultures of conformity, there's a real need to actively disrupt some of the impact of cultures of conformity and of hierarchy. And I think hierarchy is the particularly interesting one because we often think about hierarchy as a way to get things done efficiently, but we don't think about the power imbalances that that creates. And if we look at Edwina Colon and Henderson's work on power sharing, right, I'd like to think about organizations thinking of sort of auditing what are the sources of power in our organization and how do we work to actually shift some of that power to collective decision-making and collective group action so that we're redistributing some of the unintended consequences of hierarchy while keeping the efficiency part, which we like, right? Intervening to preserve psychological safety. So organizations are smart to continue their prioritization of diversity and representation and leadership. A lot of organizations recently have set goals around representation at the exec level or the board level. And then similarly, we need to continue to select for and train, right? Couldn't not throw a development note in there too, and train or develop inclusive leaders to help disrupt impact of both cultures of conformity and in some instances, social identity threat. And then the last one, which I kind of find the most interesting and I'm sort of excited to go into next, is this has real implications for how we engage white employees in DE&I work, right? I think it's really important to understand that psychological safety is not psychological comfort, okay? So engaging in DE&I work takes talking about things that are challenging, and that in and of itself is a method of interpersonal risk, right? I have to be willing to, in a group, acknowledge the ways that I benefit from structural power and privilege as a white woman, right? But what I've seen is that cultures of conformity, right, and hierarchy in my organization can actually trigger my own racial identity threat and make me less likely to engage in those conversations, right? Thereby potentially being one of the reasons why so many DE&I efforts fail. And so we have to think about how do we promote psychological safety for white employees without mistaking it for making them feel comfortable, right? I want to make sure that that's super clear. And then last, before I close, study limitations. So I did use a convenient sample. And as I mentioned before, I had a raffle. And as much as I love to believe that everyone in this world is good, there are so many people who just fake entered my survey to get an entry to my raffle. And so I had to use a really stringent method of data cleaning to ensure all of my data was real. And as a result, I finished up my collection via Prolific. And I have in my appendix, if you're interested, sort of differences in study variables between both people I kept and people I dropped, and also between Prolific participants and convenient sample participants. Second, it's correlational design. So although we can infer causation from study 1, we can't from study 2. And then obviously I use adapted measures, which I piloted using good validation techniques, but I didn't fully validate either of them. And then I promise this is the end, right? Future research directions, I could talk about this forever because I'm very excited. One is understanding the intra-individual processes between social identity threat and psych safety. So I mentioned them to you, those cognitive processes, but I didn't explicitly test them, right? So I think there's an opportunity to actually validate that, yes, this is what happens intrapsychologically and individually when social identity threat occurs. We've got a whole host of antecedents and moderators now for psychological safety that we didn't have previously when we didn't consider the role of social identity. And then I would like to see some testing of the other moderators or boundary conditions that I include in my theory, but didn't test here. So things like your identity centrality, or how much you identify with the organization in which the threat is arising, and does that actually change the impact of social identity threat? The impact of discrimination on psychological safety. Thinking again about social identity theory of psych safety and how that specifically applies to white employees. And then I'm also interested in how my findings in the theory in general applies beyond racial social identity. So the identity threat that I measured both in, or described in the theory and measured in my studies, was explicitly racial identity, but I'm interested in how this might apply to other marginalized social identities like gender or sexual orientation or ability, for example. That is it. I can't talk because I will start, oh no, there we go. I can't talk because I will start crying. But this has been such a whirlwind 6 years full of lots of peaks and a lot of valleys. And I'm super grateful for my family and my friends and my committee and Dr. Edmondson's work. And I have to give a particular thank you to Myra, who's here, who might as well be also earning a PhD. Because if you are ever the partner of somebody earning a PhD, it is like 6 years of full sacrifice. And she had 2 babies along the way. So thank you for everything.
All right, thank you for that presentation. We'll start with questions from Dr. Edmondson.
It feels so wrong to go first. I'm just like out here in the, you know, far away. I guess some of you are far away too, but it's, anyway, let me start by saying this is an amazing piece of research. And I knew that already, but I did not know how beautifully you present or how clearly and carefully and enthusiastically you explain things, right? So where are you going next? It's a serious question. No, no.
Great question. Let's talk.
God. Yeah, well, we need to talk. So let me just say, and I wish, one thing I will say before asking a couple of questions is I wish that I had known of this research a year, I guess it's even maybe a little more than a year ago, because Derek Bransby, a PhD student of mine, and I just did a kind of update 10 years later, just looking at the literature, what's out there today. On psychological safety to sort of update Edmondson and Lee, and because they asked me to, and it's the title of the new review is Psychological Safety Comes of Age, and I think that's, you know, it's no longer nascent or even intermediate, it's very much a mature literature, and you're making it even more mature and important. So questions. I want to ask just a kind of little question around the results and then a bigger question. So the little question is this, or, you know, maybe I'll ask it in a playful way first, which is, how sad should we be that microaggressions didn't work, right? That you had to ditch the microaggressions?
Yeah. Good question. How sad?
How sad? Yeah. Because, you know, we're sad when our models change, right?
Models change. You know, I was not particularly sad. And that's because I think the explanation for it is essentially pure, in some ways, purely a statistical one, right? Which is, if I really had my druthers, which I don't yet at this stage, is, you know, when I think about social identity threat, I think about it as an affective and a cognitive reaction, right? So if I really thought about it, I would entirely take out those behavioral perceptions and be left with just the affective and cognitive piece of social identity threat. And then I think if you clumped those behavioral items in with microaggressions would work just fine. I think the challenge happens statistically when you try to pretend that social identity threat is also a behavioral thing. So I think it's more of a function of sort of the measure itself than actually any theoretical kind of conclusion about the relationship between and social identity threat.
I like that answer. And if you had to, like, is that statistical really, or is that phenomenological?
It's construct validity of Bellamy scale.
What?
It's validity of the scale of the social identity threat measure, right? If we're defining social identity threat as an affect and cognitive reaction to social identity devaluation, then perceiving someone's going to be mean to me on a should be part of that scale.
Would see, I think that word perception is very important, right? Because as I was thinking about it, and as you were describing it, and I love how you take it out of the slide, the phenomena are quite muddied, I think. And actually the word perception is, I think it's worth thinking more about this because it's all perception.
It's all perception.
So why would we expect, you know, my microaggression was your attempt to be polite. Right. So, you know, why should the psychological experience of identity threat and the perception that there was a microaggression are literally inextricable.
Unentangleable. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think that
in reality, like in the phenomena.
Yeah, and I think that also, you know, that's a broader problem with just survey data, right? Is that the instance of measuring behavior occurring is analogous or is identical to one's perception that behavior occurred or one's perception that the behavior will occur. Right? And so I think it is tough to disentangle those, especially with a survey design.
Yes, I think that's right. It's if I had to choose between, you know, if I was going to be on a desert island where I was only allowed to have either social identity threat or microaggressions on there with me as a construct, I would take social identity threat hands down. Right?
So would I.
And microaggressions being a more recent and potentially aggressive concept in its own way, right? Yes, it's micro, but what does your ear hear? What does your brain hear? It hears aggression, right? The second question is more about, actually, two more then. This conclusion, I want to play with this conclusion that psychological safety doesn't operate in the same way for people of color. Is it that it doesn't operate for the same way for people of color, or that dominant groups don't have variance in the things that matter in your model?
Yeah, good question.
Or have less variance?
Yeah, good question. So I think a couple of things. I think one, psychological safety itself as a construct likely doesn't operate differently, right? We have a sort of fidelity to the operationalization of psychological safety. But I think we can see that the processes through which it gets built or hindered, right, are happening differentially, right? As in, if we look at the PAC coefficients for, you know, participants of color, they're in some cases almost 2 times stronger, right? So people are experiencing the same thing in organizations, but experiencing it in very, very different ways. And then I also think that I just lost my train of thought. You mentioned something about variability. Thank you. So also that variance question, and even just differences in like experience levels. If you look, I have a slide on this in the appendix, but if you look at the descriptive stats for social identity threat, for example, for white versus participants of color, right? White participants just have lower social identity threat with lower degrees of variance.
And
right?
Lower threat and lower variance.
And lower variance.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
but although the variance is not as low, like the difference between the variance values is much closer than the difference between the mean values.
Oh, that's interesting. But it is, you know, when you first were talking about the finding that the social identity threat didn't work in the non-BIPOC group is because, I mean, I wondered whether it just didn't vary enough, or did it vary but not correlate, right? Because that's a very different finding.
Yeah. I think less variance and just overall lower levels of social identity threat.
Yeah. Because
I
wonder,
if you're thinking
like,
about predicting, if you're thinking about predicting higher levels of social identity threat and the group doesn't have higher levels of social identity threat, there's nothing to predict. You're
stuck, right? And if you could vary it, like if you could make it vary, which you can, you know, then you'd have your model, I think, because I think there's something very true and fundamental about your model. So the last thing I'll ask, and it's really more just speculative, because as you know, you had these challenges with the data and the cleaning and the, you know, sort of convenience and the prolific, have you thought about, or would you think about doing, you know, some field research opportunities to do this, to study this further, understand it better, maybe vary it?
that would be a dream. I think, you know, when I went into this process, that was my sort of hope and intention, was to really look at this from an, you know, ecologically valid perspective of looking at this in a particular organization where I could, you know, also control for some of the organizational features that might influence this process. And I think if I'm being completely transparent and honest, part of this was a timing issue, right? And my particular role right now and faculty and just wanting to be done. And but yeah, I think I talk about this in the actual dissertation, that one next step is to actually look at some of these relationships replicated in a field setting. And I would love to do that moving forward.
Yeah, there might even be a, you know, an experiment or a quasi experiment with some training or something.
Yeah, I think particularly the impact of the environmental cues on social identity threat from an experimental perspective would be really interesting, right? I can think about how you might manipulate hierarchy, for example, and see whether that triggers different levels of social identity threat and whether race moderates that experience, but absolutely doable in a sort of controlled laboratory setting or a field experiment.
That's great. Well, I don't want to, I'll happily come back around later with some future oriented questions, but that's just great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to Dr. Gilliland.
All right, thank you. Let me just echo Amy's, you know, kudos that the way you presented this was just outstanding. You know, a lot of passion, a lot of clarity, and you taught this. You taught the audience. You taught all. So thank you. As you look at your initial model and you think about this idea of social identity threat, when I hear that concept, I think of some sort of threshold. And so, but you modeled this continuous. Do you think of it as continuous?
Wonder where that's coming from. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I think about it as continuous, and here's why. So this is in my theory, it's not in my dissertation. But one of the sort of boundary conditions of threat is magnitude and frequency, right? So there's some research that shows that the frequency of the experiencing the antecedent and the magnitude of that antecedent, right, have an impact on threat, on the degree of social identity threat that's experienced. And so when we think about how much an event can vary in magnitude from a perceptual perspective and how much an event can vary in frequency from a perceptual perspective, right, I think you have more of an infinite possibilities in terms of experience social identity threat than you might in, say, a threshold option. Though there is likely, you know, some sort of lower bound threshold at which point it becomes sort of interrupting to future, excuse me, cognitive processes. But I didn't look at that.
In study one, you found support for your directional hypothesis, but it was interesting that you found the opposite direction was even stronger. That psychological safety had a stronger relationship.
Yeah, so two things. First, statistically, it doesn't actually have a stronger relationship, right? So if we look at the path coefficient, so do you want me to go back or just talk about it? So the path coefficients, I think one was minus 0.09, which was my hypothesized one, and then the other one was negative 0.12. Makes it look like that's a stronger relationship. But if you look at the
It's a lot bigger.
really?
Yeah.
0.23 and
Oh, I didn't look at that. So I want to look and see whether those confidence intervals actually overlap. But I think, you know, one thing I didn't mention, but I should have, is if you notice in my re-specified model, I moved inclusion as an outcome of psych safety, not a reciprocal relationship. And that finding was part of the reason for doing that, right? So the idea that actually, look, psychological safety can preserve these feelings of identity valuation. And so and we think also about the sort of pragmatic utility of psychological safety on inclusion, looking at inclusion as a downstream outcome of psychological safety. Maybe even we move social identity threat, like through its ability to reduce social identity threat, right, would be an interesting kind of further exploration, because that's what that would suggest.
I wonder if it also suggests a methodological artifact or at least implication of you using weekly sampling. You know, maybe the impact of the identity threat on psychological safety is much more immediate, but and so that you would be like the next day you would see it. Whereas
interesting.
the psychological safety has a longer impact on the identity threat. And so maybe by choosing a week rather than a daily sampling something.
Right. So meaning those path coefficients might look more similar if you measure them on like a diary study. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And one thing I forgot to mention, just so people are clear, is the reason that all of those coefficients were the same, right? It wasn't that they actually were the same every week. It's that when you're running that type of model, for interpretability, you fix those coefficients because some weeks they might be a little bit higher, some weeks they might be a little bit lower. And so overall, we say kind of what is the relationship over time between these two things? So that's why they were the same, in case that was a question. Yeah, it'd be interesting to vary the time period and see if those kind of weights of those paths change based on that.
Even to get some sense of how often do we get these social identity threats?
Yeah.
How often do people of color experience? Is it a daily thing? Is this?
Well, I think the answer is it depends on the origin of that threat, right? So if we look at Steele's work on social identity threat, just being a person of color in an organization that is not predominantly people of color is in and of itself sort of an undercurrent of social identity threat, but that's very different than experiencing like some sort of act of discrimination and having that trigger social. And so that's where the frequency and magnitude piece, I think, comes in, right? Frequency of being a minority in a majority-based organization, frequent, maybe not elevated in magnitude, discrimination, active sort of overt versus subtle discrimination, less frequent, much higher in magnitude.
Just one or two maybe final questions. One, if I'm to put on my Machiavellian leadership hat, which I don't do very often, I'm going to put that on for a moment. Your model suggests that activation leads to the social identity threat, right? And so would one way to maintain or build psychological safety to be trying to deactivate environmental cues for
Interesting.
identity? So
like dismantling hierarchy.
Back on our diversity training, back on DEI initiatives, because if those are actually activating environmental cues for identity, wouldn't they be producing more social identity threat?
Make other identities more salient.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there's a couple of questions embedded in there. And then the last one's a loaded one. You know, I think let's start with that one because it's loaded and I have a clear perspective on it, right? If you go back to that sort of notion at the end that like psychological safety is not the same as psychological comfort, right? Like I do truly believe that in order to move the needle on inclusion, right, people from dominant groups have to understand the way they systematically benefit from power and privilege and structures that exist more broadly. So the answer of like, let's just not make them feel social identity threat is, I think, a horrible idea, right? I think the question of how do we deactivate the antecedent is the wrong question. I think it's how do we deactivate the threat that might arise from the antecedent, right? And that's where when we look back again at like Steele's work on identity threat, I focus primarily here on identity threat, but she's got a whole other side of it, which is identity safety, right? And so there are things that we can do sort of in between those environmental antecedents and social identity threat to also trigger, right, identity safety. Inclusive leadership is one, right, for BIPOC. So the question is, what are those moderators for dominant group individuals that are going to allow for some reduction of social identity threat? Or quite frankly, I don't really care if your social identity is threatened if you're a white individual having to engage in DEI. My question is like, it's okay to experience the threat. What are the moderators between that and psychological safety that are going to preserve your psych safety such that you can take the risks needed in those conversations to move the needle? So I don't think it's about the front half of the model. I think it's about preserving the relationship, like preserving the psychological safety that may spiral as a result of social identity threat.
You're saying that practically or theoretically?
Yes,
Both?
both.
But theoretically, wouldn't it be possible to let's de-emphasize diversity? Let's have
Sure.
everybody think with one identity. And
Great.
I'm not advocating it, but theoretically, wouldn't that work for your model perspective?
if we ignored all other constructs and theory that exist in social psychology, sure.
Maybe that's what I hired you think was a moderator, because that's kind of deactivating identity a little bit by saying there's representation in this organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's sort of the idea that, like, again, if we operate in the bubble of my model, sure, but my model doesn't operate in the bubble of social psychology and organizations, right? So we know that also pretending that everybody's the same, there's a ton of research on colorblind ideology, right? And the negative impact that has on social identity threat. And so if we can't just sort of pretend that doesn't exist in the broader spectrum, so no. But nice one.
Nice one, okay.
Maybe we change world history.
Yeah, if I could change world history and society.
Let's
then yeah.
do that just for a moment.
Okay.
Final question here.
You're having fun. You're having a lot of fun. Go ahead.
So much fun, because it's such a good.
Okay.
If you had collected your data in 2019 instead of 2023,
Yikes.
do you think your results would have been?
No.
Because of the amount of activation of identity that has happened.
Here's my hypothesis very clearly. So for those of you who don't know my background, right, like racial equity and educational equity in particular has been work that I've been doing since I started college, right? So this isn't new to me in terms of being my sort of passion or life work. My hypothesis would be that for people of color, there would be no difference in the relationships, right? There has been nothing like the inequity that exists in organizations now is not new, right? It's just of the moment, right? What I do think might be different is potentially the relationships for white individuals. And that's because going back to this idea that like now organizations are across the board saying we're about DE&I, right? Before, as a white woman, I'm in my protected prototypical privileged status where I, sort of am able to conform and fit into the dominant norms of the group. And there's no one telling me that I need to be more open-minded about it. So as a result, I'm not experiencing any social identity threat. Now that that's the constant message that's sort of communicated, right? Then it's a rising social identity threat potentially for dominant group members, which again, I don't think is a bad thing, right? It's just how do we make sure that that didoesn't prohibit people from engaging in the conversations and the work that needs to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. I pass the baton to Provost Bly.
Provost Bly.
Excellent work. I have so enjoyed this process. I know it's been long and up and down for you, but it's amazing to see your growth and development and such a wonderful outcome. So congrats, and I cannot wait to see your AMR paper come out. So keep fingers crossed there. So I have a couple of questions. I'm not like Steve, I'm not going to try to change world history here. But I have to ask a couple of questions that came up in this presentation. One is around, I'm really interested in the idea of facades of conformity. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about when we're thinking about organizations creating pressures for facades of conformity, what does that look like? What are some of the antecedents from that literature?
Good. Yeah, that's a good question. So when we look at sort of the facades of conformity literature, it's Hewlin's work originally, right? Excuse me. I wasted my voice on binary logistic regression. It's all your fault. Yeah, so when we look at sort of what part of the antecedents that Hewlin talks about in her original work, right, is not actually an organizational pressure, right, as much as it is a sort of internal psychological pressure, right? So the facades of conformity original construct and where all the literature lies isn't at that organizational normative culture level, right? It's at an individual sort of internal need to belong. And I think that's where we look at sort of like even just classic theory of like optimal distinctiveness, right? We have a need to be different, but we also have a really innate urge to belong, right? And so what happens is if we go into an environment and we realize we're different, right? Even by sole sake of our social identity. And then we see that social identity manifest in the way we wear our hair, the way we talk, the type of social activities we engage in, right? Then that then that distinctiveness gets amplified and the belonging part of optimal distinctiveness gets minimized. And so what we do in order to reestablish or recalibrate that equilibrium is we try to fit in, right? By essentially saying, sure, I'd love to go golfing on Sunday, right? When in fact, I don't golf, right? And so that sort of in an effort to literally at our innate core kind of reestablish that equilibrium. But the examples that she pulls on a lot are things like, how does organizations define social activities or fun, right? How do organizations dress? How do organizations wear their hair? What language do people use? So that sort of conformist behavior she talks about can manifest in a lot of different ways.
That's excellent, because that brings me to the second question I had, which is that when you were talking, I was thinking about Steph Johnson's book, Inclusify, and the way you were just talking, you're describing it as an equilibrium. So I have to find my equilibrium of distinctiveness and belongingness, and so
Brewer would say so, yes.
yes. So as a leader, how do I help others do that when so much of this is it feels a lot of it is intracognitive, intrapsychological. So
Yeah.
from sort of a practical perspective,
Yeah.
that's a lot to ask leaders, right?
It is, although there's a really cool study by Key that looks at the relationship between the moderating role of inclusive leadership between like team fault lines, right? And team cohesion, right? So I think the key there is, the belonging piece doesn't need to be around things that are associated with my unique social identity. So I can keep, right, the aspects of my social identity that are unique and make me distinct, and from which I sort of derive that positive self-concept. But then I think about like, what is the phase through which, or the ways in which a leader helps create sort of a team sense of belonging that is unique to that team, that is about that team, rather than about the social identity of the dominant member of that team, right? So we have to find something to collectively belong to together, right? That is separate from belonging to your social identity.
Can I follow up on that real quick?
Sure.
Because Anne has taught me that maybe inclusion is more than.
Oh, is it need satisfying by chance?
Yes. No, that's not where
I know, I'm just kidding.
Is inclusion really about distinctiveness and belongingness, or is it more about authenticity, and what would be the implications for
Yeah.
this question?
Oh, I could go on a rant about this one. So the original literature on inclusion, right, Shore uses optimal distinctiveness theory and talks about inclusion as the balance of distinctiveness, right, and belonging, or uniqueness and belonging. I don't like that definition either, right? And Jansen sort of came along and said, okay, it's not enough to be unique, right? Authenticity is a better sort of dimension of uniqueness that really gets at what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion. And specifically, Jansen talks about authenticity having to sort of manifest in two ways, right? One is you have to be able to be authentic, but you also have to perceive that your group values authenticity, right? So both of those things have to be there in order to feel high on the authenticity dimension. And so I think that goes back to sort of this idea of inclusive leadership and, right, how do you help people feel like they can show up as their authentic selves? But I think what Jansen doesn't, this is the belonging piece, we still have to feel like we belong to something, right? So I have to ensure the group values the unique, whether they be social identities or strengths or perspectives that people bring, but then we also have to create some sort of vehicle for enhancing team belonging, right? If we're thinking about it at a team level versus an organizational. You're welcome.
Sorry. No, that's good follow-up. Great, thanks. I also had a question about looking at leader representation. So we've seen, a lot of, well, I know more of the gender
Sure.
literature, and a lot of sort of backlash, and actually representation of women in leadership positions doesn't actually always help other women feel psychologically safe or.
Yeah.
So why did you choose representation? And as a follow-up, if you could now add another level, what more would you ask about the leadership of the at the organizational level? What's important about that beyond representation?
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, the majority of the research, particularly on leaders of color in positions of power, generally shows a positive effect, right? We don't see as much of the same reaction that we do when we put women in position of color, or in position of power, interestingly. Your second question was about where would I take it next?
Yeah,
in terms of
what else? I mean, what if you wanted to know you know, what was important beyond representation? Are those, yeah,
Level
exactly.
student.
Another org level moderator,
Exactly.
essentially, yeah. I mean, I think, so there's some research on that already, right? So if we look at Sing did some work in 2013 and 2015, and that was some of the first work that looked at psychological safety from the perspective of identity. Specifically, they looked at like the role of diversity climate, right? And how does diversity climate impact feelings of psychological safety? And they found, not surprisingly, that diversity climate impacts, right, positively relates to psychological safety, and that relationship is stronger for employees of color. So I think when we look at, like, we can look at climate and culture variables at the organizational level. I think we can also look, there's some research in Steele's original work on social identity threat that looks at sort of organizational policy at an organizational policy level, right? So how do organizations either espouse, and I think the key here in today's age is and make good on, right? Organizational policy, sort of diversity policy, versus we've seen even experimentally, right? Organizations that sort of espouse more of a colorblind ideology, we were talking about before, actually has a negative impact on sort of sense of belonging or inclusion.
Right, thanks. Last question, and then I'll pass to Becky. I noticed study one was like 60-something% men, and then the second one was kind of half and half. Did you, in any of your, never looked at gender,
No.
intersectionality?
No. Haven't looked at gender, haven't looked at sexual orientation, which I also have. Potentially interested in doing that. I recently wrote an article with Becky and Amber on intersectionality. So I'm certainly interested in it. I think for this particular, the driver for me in this was really looking at racial equity in organizations. And so I stayed on race in this. But yeah, definitely on purpose, collected other social identities to see if I could then play a little when this is all over. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Dr. Reichert.
Nice work so far.
Bring it.
So I guess taking a big step back, and this is your softball question.
Okay.
Why do we even care about psych safety and inclusion? Like, what's gonna change my organization if I follow all the moderators?
You're not gonna like my answer to this. Well, you might, some people might, you might not. Researchers won't like my answer to this. Okay, so I could stand here and I could tell you that we know from research that, right, more inclusive organizations lead to more creativity. We could return back to the original psychological safety kind of birth of Shine and Venice, who studied organizational change, were interested in how you had to sort of promote psychological safety in order to create change in organizations, right? Safe learning safety. And then we can look at sort of the myriad of psychological safety literature that shows all of the positive outcomes of psychological safety, from creativity to cohesion to performance to profit, right? It's rampant. I don't really care about any of that. So that's the part that you might not like. I think for me, understanding that psychological safety is deeply influenced by people's social identity, and that it plays a critical role in making people feel included. To me, as much as I love research and relationships and stats, like, to me, it's about a moral imperative, right? We should care about it because every person deserves to feel included in their space, in their life, in their organization. And if psychological safety represents a promising way to do that, then it matters. And I don't care what your coefficient is. I don't care what your model fit is, right? Like, that's not the reason why I do what I do. And I don't think it's the reason. I think the business case for diversity ship has sailed.
Sounds like a little positive psychology wrote All right, let's get into study one.
Okay.
One thing
That
that.
was my softball. Here we go.
That one was, yeah.
Here we go.
One.
Oh, that's
that-
my, guys, sorry.
What?
That's my 3rd grade student.
Aw.
Love you, Maria. She's like 20.
She's waving. So study one, you looked at
Some stuff. Yep.
you measured these things over time. You didn't talk about it today, but I think you looked at what's the percent of variance in psych safety
The ICC.
and or social identity threat that is
Stable.
stable versus Well, more state-like is what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Who's interested in development, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, so what she's asking is essentially like, whenever you look at a variable over time, you're able to disaggregate it. Sorry, this is my stats brain, can't not explain, right? You're able to disaggregate it into pieces that are stable over time and pieces that vary, time varying, right? And interestingly, they're both actually fairly stable. So if we look at social identity threat, I think the ICC was 0.76. So that essentially means that about, 24% of the variance in social identity threat varies as a week to week. Again, we're looking at weeks, so it could change if we were looking at a broader time period. And then psychological safety is even more stable. So the ICC was 0.82, right? So that's like 18% of state-like variance from week to week. And what's super interesting about that, if you understand sort of variance and stats, is that even with that little week-to-week variance, we still get causal relationships. It's pretty rare when usually in order to find causal relationships cross-leg over time like that, we would expect the time varying nature of the constructs to be a lot stronger, but they're pretty small.
So what are the implications for model study 2 then, knowing that stability of those variables?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one, it's not necessarily knowing the stability of those variables, it's knowing the lack of stability of those variables, right? Which is that which is small, but changeable, right? Like if it was small, but we didn't find significant relationships over time, then I would say, fine, treat it like stable and study 2 holds as is, right? But the fact that it does change actually means that like the cross-sectional relationships that we're looking at, right, potentially have an ability to change over time. But I think particularly with the social identity threat to psych safety relationship, right, we're more able to infer that as causal in model 2 than we might be if we hadn't run kind of study 1.
Yeah. I was gonna ask the same question as Stephen about the minus 0.28 and minus 0.13 relationship between psych safety and social identity theory and the BIPOC model.
I have to check it.
With psych safety having a double size effect on SIT.
Yeah.
What are the implications for the study 2, given that?
Given the fact that for employees of color, that relationship is stronger.
That psych safety seems to be causing social identity threat
Yeah.
more so than the reverse.
Well, I think first of all, there's like, and in addition to the reverse, right? As opposed to instead of the reverse. I think one thing that came up before was like, does psychological safety actually preserve inclusion via reducing identity threat, right? So there's an opportunity to study rather than social identity threat as a mediator between antecedents and psychological safety, moving it. But I almost think it would be interesting to leave social identity threat where it is and actually measure identity safety as a mediator, right? So psychological safety, we know reduces identity threat from study 1. So in theory, that would increase identity safety, which would therefore, right, increase inclusion. So I think that's one implication. And then the second piece was that was part of why I moved inclusion as a more distal outcome, right, of psychological safety, because we clearly see some kind of causal ability of psych safety to promote versions of identity valuation, which is part of inclusion. If I hurry, Riker, my voice is going. Just kidding.
I just have 2 more questions.
Yeah.
And they're kind of more discussion oriented.
Great.
How do you, and Michelle kind of tapped a little bit on this with her question about women. How do you think the model would operate for other non-dominant groups, or even considering intersectionality? Would there just be different antecedents? As you found, like with the dominant group, there are kind of different antecedents and moderators, but do you think the whole model would still kind of play out the same, just with different variables maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think potentially for gender, yes, right? I think I think looking any identity where hierarchy sort of elevates that identity as the chosen dominant identity is going to have the same impact. And then similarly, I think cultures of conformity might be a little bit different, right? So what does it look like to expect women, like the idea of expecting women to conform to men's dominant group actually goes against what we know about role congruity theory, and the idea that like, we don't actually want women to be too prototypical of men. We want them to like also uphold their expected gender role. So I think that might be different. So I would say, you know, sort of bottom line, some of the antecedents might hold, some might be different, depending on the social identity group that we're looking at. But I do think the identity threat to psychological safety link and that playing a role of inclusion, that would function similarly.
Sounds like a whole research program.
Sounds like a whole research program.
Last question, and then we'll circle back to Professor Edmondson if she has anything to follow up on. If you had to do it again, what would you change?
I should have known this one was coming. Oh gosh, I do it again. I would have done it in an organization. That's a big one. I think I would have spaced out my study one collection. I would have been more interested in looking at it like over a longer period of time.
Like weekly or?
No, I think like maybe every 2 weeks, but for a longer period of time. And then I think I would have picked different moderators, right? I mean, inclusive leadership is really important, but we know it's really important. And so I think I would have wanted to sort of, in the same way that I kind of critically ask myself, like, what are the organizational features we don't always think about, like hierarchy? I would have wanted to ask the same question of my moderators, like, what are the boundary conditions of this that we don't automatically think about that may actually play a role here, and use those.
Cool. Thank you. Professor Edmondson, anything to follow up on?
Well, I don't really, I mean, the only thing I would ask, and it's actually related to your final question there is, if you had to leave this room right now and go next door and speak to a room full of managers, what is your number one recommendation for them?
Yeah. It depends on what their goal is, but so I would say two things. I would say if you're going to make good on this commitment to inclusion thing, you've got to prioritize psychological safety, right? And you need to figure out what things you're doing in your organization, whether you're meaning to or not, are actually either helping or hurting psychological safety that might not be as obvious as you think they are, right? You need to audit essentially the major features of your organization to figure out which are helping psychological safety and which are hindering it, and by sort of subsequently impacting people's sense of inclusion.
But Dr. Diaz, we were hoping you would tell us what we need to do.
Good question. Well, the problem is that people's antecedents are going to function differently in your organization. Everybody's organization is different. I think if you want some bite-sized pieces of advice, right? I think I would tell organizations that you need to think about what the people at the top of your organization look like, right? And regardless of what they look like, how are those people at the top of the organization making space, right, for people to bring their authentic selves to work?
I have a follow-up.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
Hypothetically, let's say you're one of those leaders that's getting near the top of your organization,
Like
and
those
you're
leaders?
trying to.
Like you're a
create-
provost? Are you trying to get me to solve all your problems, Michelle? Okay.
Like Dr. Edmondson, I need some answers here, Dr. Diaz. So because it strikes me that one of the challenges is that a leader, you try to set space and you try to set role model, but there are lots of other people that act in ways that don't, and you can try to, call those out, you can try to discipline, you can try to reward, but at the end of the day, it often feels like there's you need a critical mass of managers, and when you don't have that critical mass, what do you do?
Good question. What'd you say?
ASA.
I was just about to say, yeah, so, just kidding. So if you think about culture,
Writing that down.
no, yes, please. So if you think about cultures of conformity specifically, right? Like one of the challenges of why this is so hard to dismantle both hierarchy and cultures of conformity, right? Is that like, we know from classic attraction, selection, attrition theory, right? That organizations attract, right? That's how dominant cultures get formed in organizations, right? We all act this way, so we call our buddy who acts this way, right? They come get attracted to the organization, they get selected because, wow, they're just like this other great person, right? And then the people who are like, I don't fit into that dominant narrative, I leave, right? And so I think there's a couple of things. I think the first is being careful about that attrition piece, right? So by having that type of culture, and this is all too real right now, right? You're gonna lose people who feel like they don't fit in that culture. So rather than trying to break apart the dominant culture, I think the other effort is how do you elevate the people who maybe feel like they don't fit in there, right? And how do you ensure that even if the rest of the group doesn't value them, that those with power and status do, right? So you can signal that identity valuation by saying like, hey, these peers might not, but at the organizational level, we do, right? And so you can't lose those people, because if you lose those people, game over, right? And then I think the other is about like attraction and selection, right? I mean, like there's an I in me somewhere, right? That says like, you have to be deliberate about recruiting diverse candidates, and not just diverse in terms of demographic differences, but diverse in terms of perspectives. And then I've worked a lot recently with cities and departments and even police departments on like, how do you integrate things like cultural competency explicitly into your selection criteria, right? Because it's amazing how many organizations say they care about it and they don't select for it, right? So as much as I like play mostly in the O side of things, I do believe in the like, you have to get the right people on the bus perspective. And so I think that's a big part of, if you want to move the needle, you essentially have to interrupt ASA. And you can do that from the bottom or from the top.
Thank you.
All right, so I think what we'll do, since there's only 3 of us, is we'll go out into the other room rather than asking everybody to leave. Dr. Edmondson, I'll bring you with me on my left.
Okay, I was wondering how I was gonna follow. This will be fun.
Actually, I should probably make a breakout room.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put you in a breakout room. And then we will see where we're at. Come back in and see what other questions people have. And so,
Okay.
all right, give us a second, Amy, and I'll put you on my breakout room.
I think I can do it, Becky.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
And then I realized that I was on camera. Hey,
I'm
everybody.
expecting to be invited to a breakout.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Hi, brothers, wherever you are.
Hey. Hey, I like the whole tone of that.
You liked it.
Oh, there's. So they're just talking in another room and they'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Hmm.
Really fun. I mean, I don't think so, June, because it's really loud in here. You wanted to ask. Hi, Ken. It's not that I'm not saying hi to all you other people, it's like Ken's the cutest one. Hi, Kate. Thanks, Joe.
Like in front of.
Now I'm gonna cry. Hi, Lindsay and Gunner. I like that it says Lindsay and Gunner. Now you see why they were not allowed the whole presentation.
Guys, we want to be you when we grow up.
Crazy.
Why did they go with her?
I want to bring that to you, Dr. Diaz.
Thank you very much. I'm super grateful. It's very surreal, very strange. And I'll see you all back here. Amy, thank you so much. I can't even tell you how honored I am that you joined us today. It's like, I thought it wasn't real when you wrote back. So thank you so much. I'm super honored and hope.
No, I congratulations. And it was an absolute pleasure and privilege to be a part of it. And please reach out at any time. Don't be scared by my auto reply. Would love to help if I can and stay in touch either way.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.